to visit me to see what was going on, because that was food tourism in those days, the beginning of people recognising that we had a food tourism business on the go, or a sibling thing all over, not sibling, what do you call it?
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I got to go, but nice talking to you. Yeah, that could happen again. You could make Meraki a tourist mecca.
One thing I want to tell you about is, are you waiting on the news?
Oh, well, I've just got a couple of things to do before the news, but go on.
Okay, so a lady came here the other day, and she'd seen a stoat running down the main street chasing the main driver to Meraki, chasing a wee baby rabbit.
I hope the wee baby rabbit won. Fleur, lovely to talk to you as always. Fleur Sullivan, and you can hear the bustle in the background from Fleur's place in Meraki. It's interesting to hear the other point of view on rabbits. I don't think I've had a conversation like that on the panel. We've always talked about the obvious problem with rabbits.
Yeah.
But she sees the beauty in...
I love rabbits.
A rabbit.
Yeah, but in moderation, right?
Yeah, on my biking track, there's little bunnies, and they keep killing them off, and when I see a little one pop its head up, I go, yay.
We were talking with Joe Holmes from the Auckland Ratepayers Alliance before about the big RV increases on Waiheke Island, and the implication in some people's minds that rates might go up by more than 60% if your RV does. Dean Knight, a senior lecturer from the Faculty of Law at Victoria, says it's nonsense to suggest increases in rating valuations affect a local authority's income. As a matter of law, they don't. A local authority sets its budget and costs, and the ratings valuations only influence how the rate take is distributed across the district. An individual rates bill only goes up if a property's valuation goes up by more than the average. Yes, and that's why we were talking about the fringe areas of Auckland, and down if it doesn't. And to avoid any doubt, says Dean, a local authority receives no windfall if rating valuations go up. Yes, it's all proportional. What else can I ask you about before we go? Defence Minister Ron Mark has admitted wearing medals that he shouldn't be wearing, and it's not the usual story at all of having, claimed to have been in the SAS when you were just the company cook.
They were his medals,
They were
weren't
his
they?
medals.
Yes.
And they are entirely gamefully worn, but he's now seeking permission to wear them without being criticised. They were earned in the service of Oman, but it is a breach of rules for a New Zealand citizen to wear medals from a foreign nation without the Queen's permission, able to be granted by the Governor-General. Did you know that?
I had no idea.
No, and I'm so glad I don't wear my medals. But
have you actually got medals?
No, well, of course I've got medals.
Yeah,
but not like Ron Mark's medals.
No, I don't have them like Ron Mark's medals. No, but I didn't know that, Jim. No, I didn't.
This has been a hot topic among veterans, apparently, and you can probably see their point of view. But should it be an issue, do you think, that Ron Mark wears medals from Oman? He obviously didn't know and didn't think it was.
I really think there are probably more pressing issues in the world today than this.
I kind of
figured. That was my response.
Yeah. I kind of agree.
I thought it was kind of weird that the Queen had to allow you
to wear your medals.
Okay.
It's a bit like that Australian thing of having to, be a citizen, even if you didn't think you knew you were.
Yes. Finlay McDonald, lovely to see you. Thank you for being on the panel today.
Good to be here.
Julia Hartley-Moore, always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely weekend if you're not working, or even if you are. And that's us. We're back on Monday, and Checkpoint very soon with Guy and Espinal.
No mai haere mai, piki mai, kāke mai, kei te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irarangi e wā o Aotearoa. Kia ora, good evening and welcome to Checkpoint. I'm Guy and Espinal. Tonight on the programme, lots on Manus Island. Trans-Tasman divisions deepen over this issue. A leaked Australian intelligence report claims detainees are responsible for sex crimes with underage children, some as young as 10. Another Manus Island security guard comes forward, putting his name to calls for New Zealand to withdraw its offer to take 150 refugees. Amnesty International hits back, saying these claims are politically motivated to save face for Australia, and the National Party warns that trans-Tasman relationships are souring over this issue. Also, Checkpoint school fees are out for a Palmerston North school.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batanaho. A former guard on Manus Island says New Zealand should take back its offer to Australia to accept some of the refugees from the now decommissioned Australian detention centre. The government has said its offer to rehome 150 detainees still stands, despite revelations of child sex abuse and drug dealing by some. John Haller, who was a guard in the Papua New Guinea detention centre from 2013 until last month, told Checkpoint he witnessed many episodes of violence.
At one stage, we were allowed to restrain them. We could keep the violence to a minimum. As soon as the centre itself was made or deemed illegal by the PNG government, we weren't allowed to lay hands on anything. All we could do was watch and report.
John Haller says most of the violence was against other detainees. He says his advice to New Zealand on whether to take in the detainees would be don't do it. The government hopes to have its ban on foreign investors buying existing homes in place by February. The Housing Minister, Phil Twyford, says he's not worried about a last-minute surge of buying before the ban. Our Auckland correspondent Todd Nile reports.
Phil Twyford says when Australia introduced a similar policy, it was followed by $30 billion of foreign investment into new housing, a trend he'd like to see in New Zealand. Labour pledged to make the change within its first 100 days, making it early February and probably effective immediately. A large real estate website, Juwai, says it'll run a month-long campaign in December, promoting New Zealand to Chinese investors before the change takes effect. Mr Twyford says he's not worried about the promotion. Atu I Tamaki Makoro, ko Todd Nile tēnei.
London police have recovered and identified the last two victims from London's Grenfell Tower fire, and they say the final death toll is 71. A faulty fridge in one of the flats in the 24-storey building is believed to have caused the inferno. The commander of the London Police says it's been a challenging forensic identification and recovery process. The BBC's Tom Burridge reports.
Only now is Scotland Yard confident it knows how many people died. Commander Stuart Cundy said the search and forensic work on tons of debris on each of the 24 floors was a complicated process, which, along with going through other evidence, took time. In the days and weeks following the fire, there was confusion about how many people had died. There was also deep scepticism here in the community about official estimates. The Metropolitan Police can now focus on making progress in its criminal investigation. Officers have seized more than 30 million documents, and they've been studying the role of hundreds of companies linked to the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower.
Tom Burridge in West London. An Australian Royal Commission has recommended a controversial youth detention centre near Darwin should close. The Commission has been investigating reports of systemic abuse at the Dondale Centre over many years. The ABC's Sarah Everingham reports.
The Commissioners have found the Territory's youth detention centres were not fit for accommodating or rehabilitating young people, that children were subject to verbal and physical abuse and were denied access to basic human needs such as water. It found the Territory Government failed to comply with statutory requirements that all children in out-of-home care have timely care plans. The report recommends the closure of the Dondale Youth Detention Centre and the High Security Unit, raising the age of criminal responsibility to 12 and allowing only children under 14 years to be detained for serious crimes.
Sarah Everingham reporting. The Treaty Negotiations Minister says his first meeting with the Ngāpuhi Hapu Alliance Te Kotahitanga has been very constructive. Andrew Little has been meeting both factions in the Ngāpuhi mandate dispute in Waitangi today as he embarks on the job of restarting the iwi's stalled settlement process. He says progress on the settlement is essential, not just for the good of Ngāpuhi, but for the good of the country.
This is the last remaining very large treaty settlement to go through and to be achieved. This is a core building block to our sense of nationhood and our nation building. We don't get to make progress for our future until we fully come to terms with that past.
Andrew Little says the task is to ensure Ngāpuhi's many hapu are represented at the negotiating table as ruled by the Waitangi Tribunal. A man has died after his body effectively turned to stone. Callan Fabian, who was 44, suffered from the rare autoimmune disease scleroderma, which hardens the skin and restricts movement. He died yesterday. And Wills, who started the Scleroderma Auckland support group, met Mr Fabian 5 months ago, and the group raised more than $23,000 for his care.
Every time we saw him, he had a big grin on his face, and he was always so pleased to see any of us. And he was just absolutely blown away by the support that he got and all the messages.
Anne Wills from the Scleroderma Auckland support group. It's 5:05. Sport. The Rugby League World Cup has reached the knockout stage, with Australia playing Samoa in Darwin tonight in the opening quarter-final. Tomorrow the Kiwis play Fiji in Wellington, Tonga faces Lebanon in Christchurch, and on Sunday Papua New Guinea and England square off in Melbourne. The Kiwis' captain Adam Blair says they can't afford to get bogged down in the shock loss to Tonga last weekend.
We put that aside early in the week, and it's all about, the focus on the Fijian team, and I guess making sure that we do things better that we didn't do well last week, and making sure that we get it right on the field, because this is do or die.
Kiwis captain Adam Blair. The All Blacks midfielder Sonny Bill Williams has had plenty of ribbing from teammates after seemingly forgetting what game he was playing in the test against France in Paris last weekend. Williams was sin-binned when he deliberately threw the ball out in goal during the match, something which is okay to do in his former code, rugby league. At a media session in the lead-up to this weekend's test against Scotland, winger Rieko Ioane cheekily suggested, given Williams' busy sporting schedule, they need to make allowances for him.
He does boxing and league, so, he changes up between the three every now and then, but, we'll forgive him for that. And we'll forgive him for his moustache as well.
All Blacks winger Rieko Ioane. Australia have recalled wicketkeeper Tim Payne to play his first cricket test in 7 years, naming him in the Ashes squad for the series against England. The 32-year-old last played a test in 2010. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, a mixtape from the film composer Stephen Gallagher. Country Life joins the space race and meets a Kiwi paying his rent with peppercorns in Cambodia. We look forward to the Canterbury Guinea Pig Show, and given it's 100 years since Russia went red, we have a sonic tonic dedicated to Utopia and its opposite. On Nights, Revolutionary Radio with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland fine today, apart from a few showers in the east, cloud increasing and patchy rain developing overnight. Auckland to Kapiti Coast, including Coromandel Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Mainly fine, however, patchy rain developing from Auckland to Waikato and Bay of Plenty tomorrow evening. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa and Wellington, mainly fine, apart from a few showers in the ranges. Cloudy periods tomorrow with showers about Gisborne and northern Hawke's Bay. Nelson and Marlborough, fine, apart from isolated showers about the ranges this afternoon and early evening. Canterbury, areas of cloud and isolated showers clearing to fine tomorrow. Buller, Westland, Otago and Fiordland, increasing fine spells, isolated showers about northern Buller tomorrow. Southland, cloudy periods today with a few coastal showers, fine tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks very much, Katrina. Kia ora, good evening. I'm Guy Espiner in this week for John Campbell, and we begin tonight with Manus Island. Questions are being raised about New Zealand's refugee vetting process following the release of a report claiming some Manus Island detainees were involved in drug dealing and also involved in sexual activity with underage girls. Now, New Zealand's offer to take 150 Manus Island men is still on the table, and the government has also pledged $3 million towards their care. But details of a report published in today's Australian Financial Review claim some asylum seekers travelled out of the centre to engage children in sexual activity. Now, John Haller has spent the past 4 years working at Manus Island. Prior to that, he worked for 20 years as a prison guard. Mr. Haller said it was well known within the camp that detainees regularly visited a brothel in the nearby town of Lorongau. He told me a bus service was provided for refugees to travel from the detention centre into town every day, and they had money to spend.
The gates were open, they were allowed to wander wherever they liked, except in certain areas where the Navy was, and that was, it's Navy base, so they couldn't go too far around that area itself. But we had buses that run Probably 6 trips a day, 6 to 9 trips a day, go in, drop them off, come back, pick them up. That was part of the open centre policy. So these guys could just jump on a bus, go into town. Some of them would go in just for the day, some would go in for weeks. They could just come and go as they pleased. A lot of these guys have parents back at home that will send them money. Money was no object. You know, it was just the gambling tables and everything else that were there. And everything. I mean, there was thousands, literally thousands upon thousands of dollars sitting on tables. Money in there was just, it was rife.
Again, do you have evidence? Did you see and witness any of that stuff?
Oh, yeah. Well, it happened every night, especially your money on the card tables and everything else like that. There was just thousands of it. You know, you're looking at stacks.
So you were looking, you saw stacks of money on card tables?
Yep. Before the money come out, there was cigarettes. You could stand there and there would be 50, 60 packets of cigarettes sitting on the table.
Well, John Hauler said that while he was there were supposed to be 65 security guards on the ground in the camp at all times. But he says that sometimes there are as few as 25 guards, and it would not be unusual for them to be surrounded by agitated refugees.
They made a lot of threats of violence through the fence and everything else like that, and it wasn't until our actual emergency response group kitted up and actually moved in there that sort of we got that situation under control. But the guys were, belted and thumped and kicked and everything else like that way in the process of doing it. We had quite a few incidents of them rushing, like the Sallyport area, which is sort of where our officers' station were and everything else like that. And they'd come out and start on different officers and everything else like that. We had a guy that was just about scalped one night, and 3 others were beaten and a couple were knocked out trying to assist him.
So what do you mean scalped? I mean, they attacked his head and what
They
happened?
attacked him and hit him over the head with it was a rod anyway of some sort, and it split a big patch of his head, just ripped it clean off. I can't say how many stitches he had or anything else like that. I know he had quite a few, but yeah, it just sort of clean ripped the skin off his head, and then you could see his skull.
In terms of how often this happened, what would you describe the level of these incidents as? I mean, are you talking about half a dozen a day or more, or what sort of magnitude are we talking here?
On an average, you could be. I mean, it all depended on the day more than anything else like that. Some days you'd have anywhere up to 10. Some days you'd have 2. It all just depended. But, you know, on an average, you're probably looking 6, 7, 8 a day.
So what is your advice to New Zealand about its offer to accept 150 or up to 150 of these former detainees?
Don't do it. Don't do it.
So that's the Manus Island security guard, John Hauler. He left Manus Island when the detention centre was decommissioned at the end of October. Now, we wanted to know about the refugee vetting process. We asked the Immigration Minister, Ian Lees-Galloway, for an interview today. He declined, as did the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. So we went to former Immigration Minister, National MP Michael Woodhouse, who, with then Prime Minister John Key, initiated the offer offer to take Manus Island refugees in 2013. Now, he also declined to be interviewed, but Immigration New Zealand was available. Their National Manager for Refugees is Andrew Lockhart. Just a few minutes ago, I asked him to explain how it is that the refugee vetting process works.
First thing is that as part of the referrals, UNHCR undertake an assessment. So all of our caseloads come from referrals by UNHCR. They will look at exclusion and security issues when they're doing that, and they can choose not to refer where they've got those concerns. When they come across to us, then we'll make an initial assessment to determine immigration risk and security risks, and those occur before anybody goes out to undertake those interviews. And then when the interviews are conducted, they look at the credibility around the claim itself, they'll look at security, and they'll look at character, and on mission we will take the biometrics and then undertake, when we come back, checks with our 5-country partners. And then as part of the assessment, we actually undertake security and character assessments onshore once we get back, and then that's followed by health checks. And where a refugee doesn't meet all of the requirements, then they can be declined, and the UNHCR are advised.
And all of that happens before they set foot in New Zealand, does it?
That all happens before we make a decision about their resettlement in New Zealand, yes.
OK, so from the sounds of that, then you would be using the security services, whether it's the SIS or whatever, and also the counterparts in the Five Eyes countries to cross-reference whether there are any concerns there.
Well, I'm not going to go into the details of who we talk to when we do security checks or how we do them, but they are full and comprehensive security checks.
What about in cases where records have been destroyed?
How do you mean destroyed?
Well, from what we've been hearing, there are some individuals whose documents have been destroyed. It does happen, doesn't it, for some who are seeking asylum or refugee status?
Well, that you're talking about there about people who might claim refugee status onshore, but when we are offshore and doing cases for resettlement in New Zealand, then we know that they're referred by the UNHCR, and the UNHCR have gone through a process of registration, identity, like I said, around the assessments of exclusion, and determined that they're actually a refugee and they're in need of resettlement in one of the resettlement countries. And there's 27 resettlement countries, so we're one of those.
Would you, in the normal course of practice, talk to, say, the security company or the guards who'd been dealing with these people on a daily basis? Would that be taken into consideration?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to go into how we make those assessments in detail, but we check the credibility. We look at the refugee claim, we look at their full circumstances, and we'll make an assessment from there. I think it's really important to differ between quota refugees, which are already determined to be a refugee and referred by the UNHCR, versus an asylum claimant who may claim when they're in New Zealand, and then they go through quite a separate process. We don't take anybody from offshore that's an asylum claimant. We only take people who are being found and determined to be refugees and have a need for resettlement as part of that solution by the UNHCR.
And do you know what the status of the people in Manus Island is in terms of official refugee status?
As I said to you earlier, I can't comment on the Manus Island itself. I mean, I don't have enough knowledge to do that.
No, but I mean, the New Zealand government has, since 2013, had an offer on the table, so presumably the apparatus of the New Zealand government and public service has made a judgment on whether there are 150 genuine refugees, and there may well be. I simply don't know. That's why I'm asking an expert.
Yeah, but I think that offer is around people who are, that offer is for refugees that have been found to be refugees and are then identified as requiring or needing resettlement. It's not about asylum seekers.
Okay, and so presumably quite a significant New Zealand team would go offshore in a circumstance like this, and this would include, from what you've been saying, security checks, health checks, and that would all be done offshore. What sort of time would that usually take?
Well, when you're right, the missions that go up to do the selection, and I'm talking more broadly around our program, usually travel for a couple of weeks to interview and process a caseload, and that might include our immigration officers, our settlement people, and people that will undertake the risk assessments as well. So you're looking probably at a 2 to 3 week, but it can take longer depending on the complexity of the caseload itself.
And how robust have you found those systems to be?
Well, we continually review, but we are satisfied that they will identify where there are cases that shouldn't be resettled because of character or security concerns or health requirements, and there's around about sort of up to 10% of the caseload has actually declined.
So that's Andrew Lockhart. He is Immigration New Zealand's National Manager for Refugees. We are really trying to cover this from all angles. This evening we spoke to Amnesty International too about this. They say the situation for refugees on Manus Island is cruel, it's inhuman, it's degrading. Its researchers who visited recently described a psychological war unfolding with many men suffering from mental illness. Grant Belden is the Executive Director of Amnesty International New Zealand, and I spoke to him a short time ago. I asked him for his thoughts on what both Ian, the security guard we spoke to a few days ago, and John, who we've spoken to tonight, who had worked as security guards on the island. This is how Grant Belden responded.
If New Zealand was taking men from Manus or families from Nauru, we'd be relying heavily on screening from the New Zealand government, and they have a very thorough process of vetting people for potential refugee resettlement. But what's really important here is that we remember that even if there are one or two people, as you'd expect in any large group of people who've committed crimes or done things, that doesn't mean that everyone is responsible for that at all. And you've got people who are, of course, in extremely difficult circumstances, who've fled their homes, been detained indefinitely. So there's you'd expect that they'd be under some stress.
Yeah, you would, and you'd expect bad eggs in any group of people, but what these guards are saying is that it's a lot more substantial than that. How do you assess it? It's very difficult for us to assess this. I mean, these people have worked, and we've checked this out, they've worked in Manus Island. In one case, one of the guards had worked there for 18 months. We've spoken to another guy who's worked there for a number of years, and they are saying that there is a substantial number of people there who have done some pretty bad things, criminal things, and now we're hearing allegations that there have been crimes of a sexual nature, even involving children. How do you assess that?
Well, like any allegations, you've got to actually dig in and assess them based on how credible they are and what's been alleged. So you mentioned the crimes of a sexual nature. You know, the leaks from the Australian government on that, and you have to question the timing of that and why that's come out. But the leaks say themselves that those claims were never reported to police. The allegations that the local community have made, and we saw the same thing from the Australian government back in April when a group of soldiers attacked the refugee centre, injuring people. We saw the Australian government putting out outrageous claims about some of the things that asylum seekers had done, which turned out to have no basis whatsoever. It turned out that raid was the result of a drunken rampage by soldiers after a football game. You know, so really you have to be very dubious of claims made against any big group of people and take the time to investigate those properly.
So do you think that this is part of a strategic leak for political purposes? Australia's getting upset with New Zealand pushing on this issue and is putting out information into the public arena to make these people look bad. Is that how you see it?
Well, we can't say that for sure, but the timing certainly looks suspicious for this to come out now and for a similar thing to have happened back in April last time.
That's Grant Belden from Amnesty International. And after 6 tonight, National's immigration spokesperson Simon Bridges shares his opinion. He tells us Australia will never accept the deal and the refugees will never come. Now, I know there's a lot of intense feeling on both sides on this issue. We'd love your feedback. Text us 2101. You can tweet us as well at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook us, Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email. We're at checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Let's change tack now. A Palmerston North Intermediate School is offering a genuinely free education next year as it scraps the costs of stationery, sport and even class trips. Ross Intermediate School plans to get rid of fees and at the same time rid children of the burden of having to ask their parents for the money. I spoke to the principal, Wayne Jenkins, a short time ago and asked him just what exactly is being promised.
Yeah, what we're proposing is to basically remove that barrier of a financial cost to kids being able to access, I guess, what you could call the extended curriculum, extracurricular activities such as sports and the like, so that everybody gets an opportunity to take part and participation hopefully will increase, which in turn will engage kids more in learning.
OK, so what does this cover? Does this cover everything from school camps to even stationery, computers? What is involved in this?
Sure, so basically we're covering everything, but what we're saying to parents is we're going to need a hand with camps. Camps are incredibly expensive, and to just fund camps for our school would cost over $150,000. So obviously that's not actually practical, and we find that most parents accept that. The Education Act does allow for schools to be reimbursed for things like accommodation and food costs, which are obviously outside the normal curriculum that we're delivering. But we are saying to parents we need a hand with camps. In regards to computers, all children at our school do have a computer, and majority of parents are happy to provide that. We have always provided a computer for any student who couldn't. So nothing's changed there. And obviously we do still have a school uniform, but we also have options for parents in terms of second-hand uniform, and our uniform's an affordable uniform as well.
OK, so what is it that parents would have been paying for that in 2018 they won't be?
So all sports, all activities, all stationery, testing that might be done outside the normal curriculum, such as the international tests and the such, will all be covered. Basically, we're putting just on $40,000 back into our parents' pockets that historically we've received.
Oh, is that right? So what would have been the average cost that they would have been paying that will be met by you in the next year?
It will depend on the participation that the student engaged with, but for some families we're talking the high hundreds. Kids who are taking part in a wide range of sports. Sports have become very expensive for schools and for community groups that run them. So for a lot of our families whose kids are heavily involved in sports, they're going to be looking at a good saving. But the aim is to hopefully increase the participation, so kids who historically maybe haven't bothered asking mum or dad if they could play cricket, all of a sudden won't have that need to say, and I need $40 as well. So hopefully we'll see participation in sports and activities increase. OK, your students' maths probably better than mine, but if you're putting $40,000 in, it's about $100 per child, isn't it? What's your role? Roughly 400 or 500? Yeah, just over 500 students, so it's about $80 a family.
OK, so, which will be welcomed, I'm sure, by many of them. How is it, Wayne, that you're actually able to do this?
Yeah, so basically it's through a realignment of administration costs. So we did a review, and we actually found out that the costs to charge parents is actually quite high. When you take into account postage, printing, administration time, we're actually spending money to charge parents money. So we're actually, in our projections that we've made, we're going to save money by not charging parents.
Is that right? You actually
it's a bit of a paradox, but we're actually saving money by not collecting money.
So there's no one being cut off your administration team or anything like that? It's just a savings...
been a realignment of responsibilities, but there's been no job losses as a result. And the other thing to stress is that we're increasing spending in all our curriculum areas too. So we're not cutting reading or we're not cutting maths to make this happen. It is also unique because I guess we're an intermediate, we're a good-sized intermediate. That does make, economies of scale makes it a bit more affordable for us to do. I'm not saying that every school could do this, but every school in New Zealand is doing the best they can for their communities and supporting parents in a wide range of ways. So, this isn't, we're not unique in this, but I guess we're just trying to really say education should be free, and we're trying to really capitalise on the pledge that the government have made to make it easier for parents. So hopefully this will help encourage the government to get behind schools, because schools are still underfunded. People could be listening to this and thinking, people say schools are underfunded and then they're making all this stuff free. But we are still grossly underfunded, and it's exciting that the government are going to be looking at that.
Because that's the policy whereby if you don't ask for donations, I think they give you
150 a student.
150 a student, right. Hey, when was the light bulb moment, Wayne? When did you just think, well, bugger it, let's not just charge it all?
Probably been working on it for the last couple of months. This year we introduced a student support scheme where anyone without questions asked could tick a box and we would cover their sport. But what we found is there's still a level of resistance for people to have to do that, to send in, I'm sorry, we can't afford it, please help us out. The joy of this policy is actually it's not asking people to make that choice. It's saying it's going to be free for everybody. You don't need to declare that you can't afford it because no one's going to be paying for it. Yeah,
so your school, I think, a decile 6, so, you'd have some at the lower income earning end who were at your school who I imagine would be pretty relieved at a policy like this.
Yeah, I think so. And even just, your average mum and dad, your average family, both parents are working, any money in their back pocket is going to help them out. So, we've had a lot of feedback from our parents just saying, oh, look, this is really awesome, from a bigger picture point of view too of what it's sort of saying to the community. It's not just about, improving sports. It's about saying we want Ross Intermediate to be a school where you can come along and, we don't want to be ringing you and saying you owe us money. We want to be spending our time on trying to educate your kids that you send along.
Principal Wayne Jenkins there. You're with Checkpoint. Now coming up, 3 family members who were admitted to hospital after eating wild boar meat are being treated for botulism. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern asks her own questions of SaveMart after revealing last night that she has shopped there. And Christchurch turns red, but it's not for the Crusaders. First, here's Katrina Batten with the headlines.
A former guard on Manus Island says New Zealand should take back its offer to Australia to accept some of the refugees from the now decommissioned Australian detention centre. The government has said its offer to rehome 150 detainees from Manus and Nauru still stands, despite claims of child sex abuse and drug dealing by some. John Haller, who was a guard in the Papua New Guinea detention centre from 2013 until last month, told Checkpoint he witnessed many episodes of violence, mostly against other detainees. He says his advice to New Zealand on whether to take in the detainees would be don't do it. The government hopes to have its ban on foreign investors buying existing homes in place by February. The Housing Minister says he's not worried about a last-minute surge of buying before the ban. Phil Twyford says when Australia introduced a similar policy, it was followed by $30 billion of foreign investment into new housing, a trend he'd like to see in New Zealand. Zimbabwe's longtime president Robert Mugabe has been holding direct talks with the army over his future. Pictures have emerged of the 93-year-old meeting the army chief and 2 envoys from South Africa at his official residence in Harare. The army put Mr Mugabe under house arrest earlier this week after moving in to take control of the country. The Sensible Sentencing Trust says the low rate of serious reoffending by deportees shows the law is working. Figures released under the Official Information Act show just 13% of deportees, mostly from Australia, have committed jailable offences since returning offenders' orders were introduced 2 years ago. The police have seized 60 bags of synthetic drugs from a house in Porirua they say were ready to sell. A 34-year-old man has been charged with possession of the drugs for sale and for selling psychoactive substances. Those are the headlines. I'll be back at 6.
Thanks very much, Katrina. Let's turn now to the business news. Jonathan Mitchell is with us tonight. Good evening to you, Jonathan. Now, Xero's founder, he's got a bit of a payday coming by the sound of things. He's reducing his holding in the company.
That's right. This is Rod Drury. He's selling 3 million shares in Xero for around $31.50 each. So, by my calculations, that's just shy of $95 million. So not a bad way to end the week. He hasn't said exactly what he'll spend the money on, but he has said in social enterprises and charitable organisations as the such. The shares have gone to institutional and professional investors. This will help increase the liquidity in the company's shares. Drury isn't stepping away from the company as such. He's still focused on their growth plans. He remains the biggest shareholder with around 13% of the company's shares. But it does come at an interesting time. You'll remember Xero has announced plans to delist from the local NZX Top 50 Index, have a primary listing in Australia. This has been met with criticism, as we've been hearing from both brokerage community as well as investors.
All right, and the manufacturing sector, some data out on that this evening. What's it telling us?
Holding up pretty well in the month of October. This is the BNZ Business New Zealand Performance of Manufacturing Index. One of these surveys where a reading over 50 indicates expansion. So in October, it fell a couple of points to 57.2. A couple of standouts though. Production rose to over 60. Employment also picking up pace. This is quite interesting. So this is the current snapshot on what's going on with manufacturing. Other surveys have pointed out volatility from the general election, but manufacturing seems to be holding up pretty well. We'll get another reading on the services sector on Monday. It'll be interesting to see how businesses are faring in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Indeed. And what about the markets? How are they ending the week? Again, 27 points, top 50 index to 8,062. Kiwi dollar 68.5 US cents, 90.3 Australian.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Enjoy your weekend. That's Jonathan Mitchell there with a quick business roundup for us. Now, 3 family members who were admitted to hospital after eating wild boar meat are being treated for botulism, but it could be a couple of weeks before the results of toxicology tests are known. Shubu Kojimin and his wife Subu Babu and his mother, that's Alex Kuti Daniel, they were found unconscious at their home in Putaradu last Friday night after eating a meal that included wild boar. Their friend Joji Vagesi went to see the family this morning at Waikato Hospital and had a chat with their doctors.
I've been told that they strongly believe that it is botulism and they are treating the patients for botulism. However, the test samples that were collected have been sent to Queensland, so the results are a couple of weeks away at least, and needless to say, an official statement will not be made till the results are in.
Did they tell you how certain they were or what led them to that thought of botulism?
Oh, well, doctors being doctors, I'm sure they have a book to go by. I suppose they monitor the symptoms, and they will over the last 5 days, and this is the conclusion that they have come to, and I'm sure they're in really good hands. I'm sure Shibu's in really good hands. I'm inclined to believe them. I'm inclined to believe the doctors.
I mean, I guess that means, because up until now they haven't really been following a set treatment, have they? So I guess this is a good step forward.
This is absolutely a good step forward. So from this point on, I'm sure we'll have I'm sure they can monitor responses to the treatment, and then perhaps we'll have answers to biggest questions such as how long is it going to take. I'm sure that'll once again vary from person to person, depending on their age and state of health and etc., etc. But at least we've started down that road, and I'm sure this is going to be a long one.
We do have a statement from the Waikato DHB tonight. They're saying that the patients are responding to botulism antitoxin. The statement also says there's no evidence to believe there's any kind of public health issue, any broader kind of public health issue here. Well, the political fate of the Zimbabwean leader Robert Mugabe is hanging in the balance still tonight after he apparently resisted stepping down in the wake of the army's audacious seizure of power. The 93-year-old president remains under house arrest, but earlier was pictured smiling and shaking hands with military leaders and South African negotiators after crunch talks aimed at convincing him to go. So far, there's no sign of that, and the talking is continuing. Andrew Harding from the BBC is in Harare.
He's a frail 93-year-old under house arrest. But tonight, new photos of President Robert Mugabe do not show a broken man. Far from it. The generals may have seized power in Zimbabwe, but now they want Mr. Mugabe's blessing. It's a surreal time for a troubled country. On the streets of the capital, we found only a few hints of yesterday's military coup, and for the most part, an anxious calm. So, what's going on? In a sense, this is all about Mrs. Mugabe. The army intervened here purely to stop her from succeeding her husband as president, a dramatic move in a power struggle that has steadily intensified as Mr. Mugabe has grown older.
A cage at the president's.
Today, as convoys are spotted rushing between rival camps, the aim is to cut a deal that sidelines Grace Mugabe and allows the president to step down with at least some dignity.
Mugabe needs to be persuaded to resign. That's the obvious route to take. If one starts taking the impeachment route, the ill health route, and trying to get the parliamentary vote, this could be a long and protracted process, and the outcome could be uncertain.
As the haggling continues, we head far out of Harare into a poor neighbourhood to judge the mood.
You can really feel the sense of anticipation here. Zimbabweans, many Zimbabweans, are ready to celebrate the departure of the only president they've ever known. And yet, people are also very aware that politics is a dangerous business, and there's a lot of fear here. Are people still scared here?
People are very much scared.
Even now?
Even now.
Which is why you don't see big celebrations?
Of course. That's the reason.
But there seems little appetite for vengeance. In fact, plenty of Zimbabweans still respect Mr. Mugabe.
We don't blame the president, but we blame the criminals that are surrounding him and are the ones that are making this situation very badly.
But back in Harare, some of President Mugabe's oldest rivals now fear he'll dig his heels in and play for time.
In the interest of the people of Zimbabwe, Mr. Robert Mugabe must resign, step down immediately in line with the national sentiment and expectation.
And so, for now, a nation waits and wonders if and when Zimbabwe's smiling prisoner will accept defeat.
Andrew Harding with that report for the BBC. To the US now, a growing national outcry there over sexual harassment reached the Senate in Washington, with the new accusations being levelled against the Democratic Senator Al Franken regarding his behaviour before he reached public office. Now, Mr Franken has previously been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate. He has released an apology now to the newscaster Leanne Tweeden, who says he forcibly kissed her during a rehearsal. He also groped her as she slept. CNN's Ryan Nobles is in Washington.
Tonight, Al Franken, a Democratic senator and former Saturday Night Live comedian, is facing a Senate ethics investigation after claims by a radio host and former model that Franken groped and forcibly kissed her during a trip to entertain troops overseas with the USO back in 2006, before Franken was a senator.
I just remember I almost punched him, because every time I see him now, like my hands clench in the fist.
The accuser is Leanne Tweeden, a radio host in Los Angeles. In a lengthy blog post, she describes how Franken asked her to rehearse a skit he had planned that included a kiss. She says she repeatedly turned him down, but after his badgering, she relented. He came at me, put his hand on the back of my head, mashed his lips against mine, and aggressively stuck his tongue in my mouth. Franken was nowhere to be seen in the halls of the Capitol on Thursday. He skipped votes on the floor and then initially released a brief statement where he apologized, but qualified the apology by writing, quote, "I certainly don't remember the rehearsal for this skit in the same way." But Tweeden also shared this photo of Franken groping her breasts while she was asleep on the return flight from Afghanistan, something she says she discovered only by looking through photos from the trip.
There's Al Franken literally in the photo grabbing my boobs with his hands as if he's grabbing my breasts and looking at the camera and like smiling, laughing with this smirk on his face.
Franken later released a much longer statement where he wrote, quote, "The first thing I want to do is apologize to Leanne, to everyone else who was a part of that tour, to everyone who has worked for me, to everyone I represent, and to everyone who counts on me to be an ally and supporter and champion of women." The news led to condemnation from Capitol Hill leaders on both sides of the aisle. Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell called for a full ethics investigation, but stopped short of saying he should resign. Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer echoed McConnell's call for the investigation and called the incident, quote, troubling. Franken, who said he welcomes the ethics probe, has often spoke of his trip with Tweeden. In his book, he described the trip as a monumental step in the decision to run for the Senate. He even spoke about Tweeden on the floor of the Senate.
I was kind of a co-host with a beautiful woman named Leanne Tweeden. And we do comedy routines, and we'd introduce music, we'd introduce the cheerleaders.
Franken has been an outspoken advocate for sexual assault victims. He wrote a lengthy Facebook post about the allegations against movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, and last month said Congress needs to do more to help the victims.
Unfortunately, sexual harassment happens in every profession, and I think that we need to do something legislatively to make it easier for women to not only go to court, but so that this isn't secret.
Now it is the comedian and lawmaker facing serious accusations himself. Tweeden said she accepted his apology, but said she remains concerned for the victims who still feel like they cannot come forward.
I really do think the tide has turned.
That's Leanne Tweeden there, the radio host and newscaster, making the accusations against Al Franken, ending that report from Ryan Nobles from CNN. Lots of feedback in on the Manus Island issue tonight. I'm going to read a few of these. Maybe you have to read some of them later. There are a lot of them. This one in from a listener who says, "I'm a woman and I can understand that if you have hundreds of men confined to an island for years, then of course there will be difficulties. The whole situation," she says, "has been a nightmare for everyone concerned, and we should take as many of these men as we are able to." Stuart has got in touch from Palmerston North. He says it might be a good idea to find out how much the Kiwis and Aussie guards were paid on Manus Island and what their employment history is. I suspect, he says, there's a long, nasty story to tell there based on my experience of such people. And just lastly on this before we move on, disinformation. This listener says the Australians untruthfully said that the Tampa refugees were throwing their children in the water. This was then disproved, and the Tampa people who came here have been just fine. A number of people have actually pointed out that kind of comparison. We'll get to some more of that feedback because there has, as I say, been plenty of it in tonight. Moving on now, though, sun lovers beware. Slip, slop, slapping that sunscreen may not actually give you all the SPF protection that you think you are getting, because 2 brands of sunscreen have been pulled from the market and another will be relabelled after Consumer New Zealand testing found that they gave far less SPF protection than they advertised. Here's Eric Frickberg.
A smattering of sunbathers were defying Wellington's usually chilly weather today and soaking up the rays at Oriental Bay. 19-year-old student Elizabeth Mitchell always uses sunscreen and says she needs to know it's reliable.
There's rules about what we sell as food, so I think there should be the same rules that apply, that if you're selling sunscreen, it should have to go through some kind of testing to prove that it is reliable and meets a certain standard.
Her companion, James Donaldson, also wants certainty when it comes to sunscreen.
If you're buying sunscreen for the purpose of protecting yourself from the harsh rays, you want to be able to rely on that. Otherwise, you're just putting on cream that does nothing, really, you know.
But tests by Consumer New Zealand have shown you can't always rely on sunscreen brands to protect you as much as they promise on the label. The test showed Snowberry Family Plus sunscreen SPF 30 had an SPF of only 20, and Pure Blend sunscreen SPF 15++, marketed as a natural sunscreen, had an SPF of just 4. They've both now been withdrawn from sale. A third Pure South 100% natural sunscreen will no longer be labelled as a sunscreen after it listed its ingredient, raspberry oil, as having an SPF of 28 to 50, when in fact it was just 5. Consumer NZ CEO Sue Chetwin says there's a health risk from unproven claims on such products.
consumers should have absolute faith when they use sunscreen. Consumers should have confidence that when they buy sunscreen it is going to do what it says it does.
Back on the Wellington beach, Fernanda Beras, who hails from normally blistering Brazil, was well aware of the dangers from New Zealand sunshine and also needed assurance that the steps she was taking to protect herself would work.
Especially because here in New Zealand the sun is more strong, so I think it's really important because of cancer. I have some people that I know that they die because of cancer, so I think it's really important.
It wasn't possible to get responses from all the manufacturers of the now withdrawn products. But Kelly Willoughby of Hastings-based Pure Blend says she didn't test her sunscreen before putting it on the market, and she willingly withdrew it when the SPF 15 claim proved wrong.
If it tests that it's under the SPF 15, which I didn't know because I can't test it because you have to send it to Australia anyway to get tested, I withdrew it anyway because, I don't want to say it's SPF 15 when it's not, even though I've put the amount of zinc in that the guidelines say is for 15.
In a statement, the Ministry of Health says there could be a claim under the Consumer Guarantees Act if a sunscreen has insufficient UV protection. It adds sunscreens are regulated as cosmetics, but research is underway to decide if they would be better regulated as therapeutic goods like medicines. Consumer New Zealand, meanwhile, remains on the warpath. It's testing more sunscreens and will have further results around Christmas. For Checkpoint, Eric Frickberg.
10 to 6 now. Well, she gave it a shout-out on the red carpet at the Vodafone Music Awards last night. But Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she no longer shops at second-hand clothing chain SaveMart after Checkpoint revealed the unsafe and unsanitary conditions workers were forced to endure there. Jacinda Ardern was asked the usual opening question every red carpet reporter uses to get the ball rolling last night. Who are you wearing? The answer was a New Zealand designer, as expected, but also a credit to SaveMart, which Checkpoint has been investigating now for 2 months. Here's Zach Fleming with more.
Amidst the glitz and the glam of the Music Awards red carpet,
good evening, Prime Minister.
Taking a break from the hard questions after a week in Asia at APEC and the East Asia Summit, last night the questions for Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern were all about what she was wearing. It was New Zealand designer Juliette Hogan, price tag around $500. And
I've got a jacket from SaveMart as well.
Are you serious?
It's fake, of course. You'd never.
But it's from
SaveMart.
SaveMart.
Real fur, fake fur.
Yeah. And it's
from
from
SaveMart. Yeah.
Fantastic.
SaveMart Hastings.
Checkpoint has been investigating SaveMart since September. We've heard the stories of more than 100 workers, like Danielle, who worked at the Hastings store, the same SaveMart our Prime Minister bought her faux fur coat from.
I would rather eat a steaming pile of dog shit before I ever worked there again.
Danielle's minimum wage job was sorting through big bales of clothes, donated at those familiar blue bins with child cancer written on the side.
There was a dead cat in one, feces, dirty sanitary items, you name it, anything. Yeah.
And were you allowed to wear gloves when you were sorting through all these things?
Definitely not. That was a big no-no.
SaveMart has 33 stores across the country. But regardless of which one they worked at, the staff Checkpoint spoke to all shared similar stories.
It was disgusting. I was worried all the time. You'd get off for lunch break and we had no hot water in any of the stores either. So you'd kind of be either trying to find some hand sanitizer to clean yourself or, most of the time there was no soap either provided. So you're just trying to scrub off your hands after touching like urine and feces and dirt and mold and, it just kind of, you don't even want to go to lunch and eat. I was always coming home and, you'd blow your nose and you'd have dust, like black dust coming out of your nose and things like that as well. And, if you get an itch on your face, you don't want to scratch your face because your hands will always smell like terrible.
Danielle was told the same thing as every other worker we've spoken to. No gloves, because otherwise they couldn't feel the texture and quality of the clothes, or whether they were wet.
No, we were not supplied and we were told not to wear them.
That was Levin, this is Tauranga.
The gloves were never supplied, they were never an option.
And Christchurch.
We were told you weren't allowed to wear gloves because you can't feel
if the clothing's damp or the type of fabric.
And back to Danielle in Hastings.
I asked, well, you know, what if I kind of supplied my own? And they said no. And if they caught us with gloves on, that we would get in pretty major trouble.
But it's not just the dead cat, the feces, the urine, or the used tampons.
Sorting through the bales one day, I reached down and I felt a sharp prick on my finger, and it took me about half an hour to search through the bale to find what I'd been pricked by, and it was a diabetic needle. At least I think that's what it was. I ran to the manager and I told her, look, I've just been pricked by a needle. I need to go to the doctors. Can I take off work and go to the doctors and get it checked out? And she proceeded to laugh at me, and she basically told me to suck it up and deal with it and get back to work.
SaveMart was put on notice at the end of September. WorkSafe gave it 5 months, until February 21st, to fix the issues. Since then, a health and safety consultant has been employed. Owner Tom Doonan has refused all of Checkpoint's interview requests over the past 2 months. He hung up when we called him today, but he said via email he's made gloves available to all staff in all 33 stores. The Child Cancer Foundation said back in September it was concerned about the issues raised by SaveMart staff and would meet with Tom Doonan. 2 months later, its chief executive, Robin Kiddle, is yet to have that meeting due to scheduling challenges. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said in a statement this afternoon her faux fur jacket was bought from SaveMart in Hastings years ago. The statement ended by saying since she became aware of the issues at SaveMart raised by Checkpoint, quote, she has not set foot in the shops again. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
5 to 6 now. Well, Christchurch has turned red, but this time it's not for the Crusaders. It's Tonga. The small island nation soared into the men's quarter-finals of the Rugby League World Cup after smashing New Zealand, didn't they, in Hamilton last week. They'll face Lebanon in Christchurch tomorrow night. Legions of fans, young and old, have taken to Christchurch streets ahead of the game to make their support loud and clear. Logan Church went to meet them.
Christchurch's Cathedral Square, inundated by more than 100 Tongan supporters. Carla and his family have travelled from Auckland to see their country play.
Tonga is the best team this year, and they're gonna do it, Tonga. Yes, Tonga, thank you.
Carla's family doesn't rate Lebanon's chances.
Yes, maybe I give them a 1%. Maybe I give them a 1%. Maybe they're gonna win, but I know for sure Tonga gonna do it tomorrow. And we can wait for tomorrow, for the game tomorrow.
This quarter-final is a big deal for these Tongan supporters. Last weekend, Mate Mā Tonga smashed New Zealand 28-22, overcoming arguably one of their biggest hurdles in the competition. Around Cathedral Square, cars are lined up, their windows and bonnets covered with red and white Tongan flags, and people are dancing in the street. One supporter, Jay, says this game is huge for the Tongan community.
I guess it's a big deal for everyone, for all the Tongans. Especially this is an awesome team, and the players, I'm pretty sure, will make it to the final this year.
The Tongan community have also come out to financially support their team. Last night, about $15,000 was raised at a local church for the players, as they only receive a $30 per diem, minimal match payments and no victory bonuses. A supporter, Tama, says Tongans need to get out in force to back their team, who play for their country rather than money.
They're willing to play for their own country instead of, and plus, even they don't get much from us, but they still willing to play for.
It's a sense of pride.
Yes.
Canterbury Police are also making preparations, albeit with less dancing. This comes after 53 people were arrested in South Auckland last weekend, after Tonga's victory over New Zealand. Senior Sergeant Matt Emery is organising the police deployment tomorrow, and he says he hopes they don't see a repeat of what happened last weekend.
We've had some great liaison with the community this week. We're expecting an excited crowd, but from all of our planning, we're we're pretty confident we're not going to see any repeats of any sort of the violence and disorder that we've seen up north.
For these fans, the party is only just getting started, with the game set to begin at 5 o'clock tomorrow night. In Christchurch for Checkpoint, Logan Church.
Approaching 6 o'clock now, feedback still coming in on Manus Island. This one in, would any Manus Island men brought here then be able to bring in their families? Nobody seems to be asking this question, Valerie says. And James has got in touch from Wellington saying that the New Zealand government should leave Australia alone to manage their own affairs and get on with the affairs of New Zealand. And this one in simply saying, trust our immigration vetting process and show some humanity, and please, please, please help these people.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening. Ko Katrina Batinaho. Immigration New Zealand says it's confident its systems for vetting refugees are robust enough to keep out criminals. The government's offer to take some men detained by Australia at camps on Manus Island and Nauru has come under scrutiny, with allegations of child sex abuse and drug dealing by some of the refugees. However, Immigration's National Manager for Refugees, Andrew Lockhart, told Checkpoint everyone considered for resettlement has already been screened by the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. He says New Zealand officials then make their own security and character assessments and carry out health checks.
Where a refugee doesn't meet all of the requirements, then they can be declined and the UNHCR are advised.
Andrew Lockhart says about 10% of refugees are turned down for resettlement in New Zealand. 3 members of a family who were hospitalised after eating wild boar are being treated for botulism. Shibu Kocheman, his wife Subi Babu and his mother are in a stable condition in Waikato Hospital. They were unresponsive when they were admitted on Saturday. A family friend, Joji Vargas, says the doctors strongly believe the 3 have botulism.
They are treating the patients for botulism. However, the test samples that were collected have been sent to Queensland, so the results are a couple of weeks away at least. Needless to say, an official statement will not be made till the results are in.
Joji Vargas says the family's recovery is likely to take up to 6 months. The Ministry of Health is considering whether to tighten the regulation of sunscreens. This follows the withdrawal of 2 sunscreens from the market, Snowberry Family Plus sunscreen and Pure Blend sunscreen, both of which were far less effective than claimed. Sunscreen status was removed from a third. Consumer New Zealand says there is a health risk from unproven claims like these, and it's testing more sunscreens. Sunscreens are classed as cosmetics, but the ministry says research is underway to decide if they would be better regulated as therapeutic goods like medicines. A Taranaki council has rejected a suggestion adding fluoride to its water supply could expose residents to dangerous chemicals. The group New Health New Zealand has taken its legal action against the South Taranaki District Council to the Supreme Court after lower courts threw out its challenges. Yesterday, the group's lawyer claimed the fluoride used in water supplies is a byproduct of fertiliser production and could contain elements such as mercury and arsenic. The council's lawyer Duncan Lang has rejected that suggestion.
The drinking water standards are a very comprehensive set of rules as to what can be put into drinking water, and it is simply not credible to say that there are going to be dangerous or inappropriate qualities of these other trace elements from fluoride.
Duncan Lang, the Supreme Court has reserved its decision. Zimbabwe's longtime president Robert Mugabe has been holding direct talks with the army over his future. Pictures have emerged of the 93-year-old meeting the army chief and 2 envoys from South Africa at his official residence in Harare. The army put Mr Mugabe under house arrest this week after moving in to take control of the country. Andrew Harding reports from Harare.
Several senior ministers have been detained by the military. The police are nowhere to be seen. And yet, there is no indication that Mr Mugabe is about to step down and complete his humiliation. Quite the opposite. New official photographs show the 93-year-old smiling, wearing a smart blazer and receiving delegations. That's because the military, who seized power here, now desperately want Mr Mugabe's blessing for their actions. They, and many others here, want to give this extraordinary drama a veneer of legality.
Andrew Harding reporting. The emergency closure of some fisheries along the Kaikoura coast is being extended. Fishing was banned along 130 kilometres of the coast soon after last November's earthquake to help the marine environment recover. Steve Halley from the Ministry for Primary Industries says the earthquakes had a devastating effect on the coastline and it needs more time to heal. The restricted area is from between Marfells Beach, 43 kilometres south of Blenheim, down to the Conway River, south of Kaikoura. It's 6:04. Sport and playing the world's top-ranked side, the Netherlands, first up, is probably a blessing in disguise for the New Zealand women's hockey side, according to their coach, Mark Hager. New Zealand is hosting the World League final in Auckland, which features the top 8 sides in the world. The Black Sticks lost the final at the same tournament in 2015, and Mark Hager says they can't afford to ease their way into the tournament when they get underway tonight.
Probably a good team to play first up, because they're the number 1 in the world. We know how they play. We've had a couple of close games of late, but we know if we don't play well, then it could be a bit of a blowout. Mark Hager.
The New Zealand tennis player Michael Venus and his American partner Ryan Harrison have gone through pool play unbeaten in advancing the semi-finals of the season, ending ATP finals in London. They beat the US Open champions Dutchman John Julian Roger and Romanian Horia Ticău in straight sets. They went into the tournament as underdogs due to a lack of recent form, and Michael Venus wants to remain low-key ahead of the knockout phase of the tournament.
Starting again in the semi-finals, it's a level playing field for everyone. And everyone in this tournament's great, so we're going to have to play well. But yeah, hopefully we can use some of the confidence from our first 3 matches out there and keep going.
Michael Venus and the Timaru rally driver Hayden Paddon has moved into 5th place after the latest stage of the Rally of Australia. That's the news.
On Music 101 this week, we splice and dice together a supercut of the VNZMAs, the winners, beginners and complimentary dinners. We visit Kings at the Marais, where he wrote, sung, performed, produced, mixed and mastered his debut album. And the RNZ Music Mixtape, this week's guest is royalty. Sharon O'Neill has been inducted into the New Zealand Music Hall of Fame. Music 101, this Saturday from 1 on RNZ National.
I wanted to be Sharon O'Neill when I was young. Meet service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Northland fine today, apart from a few showers in the east, cloud increasing and patchy rain developing overnight. Auckland to the Kapiti coast, including Coromandel Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Mainly fine, however, patchy rain developing from Auckland to Waikato and Bay of Plenty tomorrow evening. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa and Wellington, mainly fine apart from a few showers in the ranges. Cloudy periods tomorrow with showers about Gisborne and northern Hawke's Bay. Nelson and Marlborough fine apart from isolated showers about the ranges this afternoon and early evening. Canterbury areas of cloud and isolated showers, clearing to fine tomorrow. Buller, Westland, Otago and Fiordland, increasing fine spells, isolated showers about northern Buller tomorrow. Southland, cloudy periods today with a few coastal showers, fine tomorrow. And the Chatham Islands, cloudy periods. It's 6:07 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Sharon. Sharon O'Neill, just for a second. Thanks, Katrina. It's 6:07, as Katrina said. Let's go back to Manus Island now. It's been a top story this evening. We've been covering it from all angles, really. Let's go to the opposition view now. National is saying that the new government's pressure that they're putting on Australia over resettling some refugees from Manus Island, well, they're claiming it's hurting New Zealand's relationship with its closest ally. New Zealand's offer to take 150 men from the offshore detention centre, it's still on the table, and the government has also pledged, remember, $3 million towards their care. But a report in the media today, this was in the Australian Financial Review, it claims some asylum seekers travelled out of the centre to engage in sexual activity with children as young as 10 years old. Now, questions have also been raised about whether many are legitimate refugees. National's immigration spokesperson Simon Bridges, member whose party initiated the offer of New Zealand taking 150 UN-mandated refugees from offshore detention centres. He says if the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern really wanted to help, she'd take more than 150 and she'd leave Australia out of it.
There's no question that the allegations are very concerning. I mean, be clear, I obviously don't know whether they're all true, some of them are true, or what the actual factual position is. Look, I believe we have got good screening processes, but I think ultimately you'd have to say from everything you've heard, given those, let's call them bad eggs, that are allegedly there, also given that, you know, it's very questionable how many of these are actually legitimate refugees in terms of the UN Convention. You know, there's a lot of questions here that I think ultimately mean it is a concerning situation. It's concerning that we've got a government that's ratcheting up the expectations around us taking some of them.
And we'll move to that in a second, because that diplomatic strand is important. But obviously you as a national government formally were satisfied enough that you could accept 150 genuine and screened refugees because you made the offer and it was on the table for the thick end of 4 years, right?
Well, that's right. Look, I mean, we have had a policy of 750, moved that to 1,000 genuine legal refugees. This would have been part of that. It's a long-standing offer. Now, of course, what we know is Australia never took that offer up, and I don't think, in fact, I'm absolutely certain that is not going to change in these circumstances.
So was that the position when you were in power, that you made the offer expecting it not to be taken up?
Well, look, I wasn't the minister. I mean, I think it was a genuine offer, so let's be clear about that. But I think what's important here is that what was also true is they were to be legal refugees under the convention. I'm making quite clear, especially given what we're hearing in the Australian media, to some extent the New Zealand media this morning. There's a real question about whether they would meet those criteria right now. And what is also true and became quickly apparent is the Australians weren't going to take that up, and that still seems to be absolutely the case right now.
Okay.
So you have to say on the basis of all of that, well, you know, we've got a position where the new government is really ratcheting up the rhetoric. Actually, nothing's changed factually that I can see. They still go with our long-standing offer. Australia isn't going to do it. So all you're doing is succeeding in damaging New Zealand-Australian relationship, and the only purpose I can see for that is for domestic political consumption.
Do you think that the New Zealand government should withdraw its offer of 150 refugees?
No, I think, look, in terms of the offer, providing they're genuine legal refugees, which was always our position, it's a legitimate offer. It's been long-standing. I think withdrawing it now would be the wrong thing to do. But I think to ratchet up the rhetoric, to put more pressure on an Australian position, which actually has legitimacy, is the wrong thing to do. It's damaging the relationship. And more than that, given that we know it's not going to be accepted, and Labor has to know that, actually there seems to me to be some relatively cynical sort of politics going on here. If Labor was serious about this, actually what they'd be looking to do is, you know, potentially look to take more than 150. They'd be looking to act unilaterally without reference to Australians. Be very clear, I think, for the cost, for the complexity of all the issues we're talking about, I don't agree with doing that. But I think the fact that they're not actually doing that, they're actually just sticking with the offer we made several years ago, I think start of 2014, shows that this is all for domestic political consumption, and the problem with that is it's damaging our relationship with our closest friend.
That's Simon Bridges, who is the National Party immigration spokesman. Well, a company used shock and scare tactics to convince parents to sign up to pricey maths software for their kids, a court has heard. Auckland Academy of Learning is being sentenced for 11 breaches of the Fair Trading Act. The Commerce Commission received 180 complaints about this company, the third highest number it's received under the Act. Rowan Quinn has been in the Auckland District Court.
Prosecutors say Auckland Academy of Learning preyed on parents' fears. Salespeople with no teaching qualifications gave their children a maths test secretly higher than their current school level. They simultaneously talked parents through the failings of the education system. The Commerce Commission's lawyer, Alicia McClintock, says when it came back covered in red marks, the parents were sold by the test.
There's no possible other contrary explanation for why that was occurring other than to frighten parents into purchasing this product.
The software cost up to $11,000 for a 2-year subscription. Alicia McClintock says many of the victims couldn't afford that, but worried for their children. It was a scripted hard sell that didn't inform people how they could back out once they were locked in, she said.
What Auckland Academy of Learning did was prey on parents' hopes for their child's education and their futures, and play to their fears about a potential issue developing in relation to that.
One victim, who RNZ was not allowed to record, told the court she panicked when her children's results came back. They had moved from the Philippines for their children's education. When her father became ill and they could no longer afford to pay the subscription, she was told she was not able to back out. But when she did a university course that covered consumer rights, she learned what the company was doing was illegal. The company's lawyer, Fiona McGeorge, said all of the contracts stated there was a get-out clause under the cooling-off period in bold. So if the reps didn't tell the parents, it was there in black and white.
If after the sales representative gone, if they're having any second thoughts, if they didn't perhaps take on any oral advice they received at the time, they had this document available to them to go back to, sir.
Judge Noel Sainsbury said spoken advice was still very important.
People can get so overwhelmed by the process that they don't make rational decisions and they make emotional responses. And the difficulty in this case is it doesn't get much more of an emotional response when you push the button of someone's a child's education.
The judge will sentence the company later this month. I Tamaki Makaurau, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
6:15 now. The Murupara community is hoping an iwi-supported proposal to build the country's biggest water bottling plant could revitalise the once thriving regional town. Ngāti Manawa has agreed to lease land for 2 plants that would export 18 million litres of water a day from an aquifer near the Bay of Plenty town. Some in the community believe this is a chance for the community to reverse its economic misfortune of the past. Te Mano Kōrehi reporter John Boynton has more.
Murupara felt the sting of major privatisation in the mid-1980s when its thriving forestry economy collapsed overnight, leaving the town in an economic tailspin which it has since to recover from. The town has an unemployment rate of 27%, more than 4 times the national average. Iwi leaders believe the project, which is estimated to create around 1,500 jobs, is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to secure a decent future for their members. Ngāti Manawa Kaumatua Pem Bird says water is now liquid gold.
We've been struggle street for a while now, quite a while, since Rogernomics. Full employment to no employment, full overload. So it represents that opportunity for us.
Pem Bird says Ngāti Manawa will have to ensure good kaitiakitanga or guardianship practices are followed.
But we've got to be clear as kaitiaki that it's in favour of the environment, in favour of the mauri of the water. It's part of that equation.
Ngāti Manawa and partner company Murupara No. 1 are working with several investors, including New Zealand Aquifer and other local and overseas interest. They plan to lodge a resource consent to the Bay of Plenty Regional Council early next week. Murupara Community Board Chairperson Alison Silcock says feedback about the water bottling plants has so far been positive.
There are a few queries that they have, but generally they have the confidence that Ngāti Manawa have done their homework and are proceeding in the correct way.
Ms Silcock says the water bottling plants represent the opportunity for locals to earn money and upskill.
Those that are employed will be earning considerably higher than the minimum wage. I guess it's an opportunity to have more choices if they have more money in their employment.
Muriwai White works at Bridgestone's Tyres in Murupara and loves the beauty of his rural surroundings, and he wants to ensure the environment is protected.
In terms of our water, doesn't need to be exported out of our country. I don't think it should be. They do say that there will be a lot of employment coming from that. My question is, how long will it last?
He has seen much suffering in the town after the forestry industry went bust and is sceptical about what the water bottling plant is promising.
It's happened to Murupara in the past. You know, jobs were supposed to be been guaranteed for over 30, 40 years. They sold out, went privately, and then our own people here lost out on employment. Can they guarantee this is going to be good for our people, or is it for certain people only?
The project depends on the approval of the Overseas Investment Office and the Regional Council's consent. If approved, the water bottling plant will take 2 years to build. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi nei, ko John Boynton Aho.
Coming up to 6:20 now on Checkpoint, 20 people have now come forward to claim they were victims of inappropriate behaviour by the actor Kevin Spacey at the Old Vic Theatre in London. Spacey was the artistic director there for 11 years. He hasn't commented on these allegations, many of which have come from people who worked at this theatre. The BBC's Vincent Dowd has the details.
In London, the Old Vic initially said they had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, but there'd always been talk about his, at the very least, highly flirtatious behaviour with young men in and around the Old Vic. So the theatre set up a contact point for anyone subject to that behaviour, and the information from that has now come out. 20 people said they'd been the victims of inappropriate behaviour. Most of them were former theatre employees. 14 of those 20 were told they should consider taking their complaint to the police, with very little detail about the alleged incidents. I think we do know there's no suggestion here of anyone involved being underage, but the investigation found Kevin Spacey's status at the Old Vic, the fact he was a film star, may have stopped people, in particular junior staff, speaking out. The theatre's now apologised. Kate Varra is executive director at the Old Vic.
The Old Vic apologises wholeheartedly to the people who have told us they've been affected. We've learned that it's not enough to have the right process in place. Everyone needs to feel that they can speak out, no matter who they are. Much has changed at the Old Vic in recent years, and we will continue to work to model and safeguard the open culture that we want the Old Vic to be known for.
A lot is in the hands of the complainants. Will they now go to the police, in which case we're likely to discover more about the complaints. The theatre certainly feels it's turned a corner. It's setting up a Guardians Committee to promote good practice in how people are treated. People, I think, are inevitably going to ask why the theatre board didn't feel it was already responsible for what was going on site. Isn't that one of the things theatre boards do? But the Old Vic, under its current artistic director, Matthew Warchus, will hope to place this big crisis behind it in time for its 200th anniversary celebrations next year.
Vincent Dowd reporting there for the BBC. Fluoridation of South Taranaki's water supply was necessary to help fight a high degree of poor dental health in the area, the Supreme Court has been told. A group opposed to fluoridation, calling themselves New Health New Zealand, have taken legal action against the council, which has now reached the country's highest court. The Court of Appeal and High Court have thrown out legal challenges by the group, rejecting its suggestion that fluoridation of the water supply breaches people's right to refuse medical treatment. Anne-Marie May was at today's hearing in the Supreme Court.
South Taranaki District Council's lawyer Duncan Lang told the Supreme Court that health legislation places a duty on local authorities to improve and promote health in their areas. He said a 2009 oral health survey revealed only 45% of children and 65% of adults brush their teeth twice daily using a fluoride toothpaste. A local doctor had suggested fluoridating the water supply was a much better way of improving oral health in Patea and Waverley than other methods of targeting dental hygiene.
It was Dr. Simmons' opinion that even if toothbrushes and toothpaste were free, there was no certainty they would be used. In relation to other hypothetical measures suggested by the appellant, such as banning of soft drinks and sugary snacks at school, toothbrushing programs, there is no evidence that these measures would be as effective as water fluoridation.
Mr Lang said the Local Government Act empowered the council to fluoridate the water supply and set out the duties a council had with regard to the water it provided to its community.
The water supply has got to be adequate, take all practical steps to ensure drinking water complies with the standards, and then 69W due to take all reasonable steps to ensure the drinking water supply is wholesome.
Duncan Lang said as far back as 1957 a Royal Commission had approved water fluoridation, and he rejected New Health's claim that the fluoride used in water supplies was a byproduct of superphosphate production. He said that was not necessarily true in all cases, and there were standards for additives put into water.
The drinking water standards are a very comprehensive set of rules as to what can be put into drinking water, and it is simply not credible to say that there are going to be dangerous or inappropriate qualities of these other trace elements from fluoride.
Mr Lang said if the Supreme Court ruled fluoridation was a medical treatment, then the council stood by the High Court finding that there was only minimal intrusion into a person's rights if it was added to drinking water. The court has reserved its decision. For Checkpoint, Anne-Marie May.
It's coming up to 25 minutes past 6 on Checkpoint. Well, aggressive or nitpicky managers are a major cause of people leaving their jobs. Who would have thought? Certainly not the case at Radio New Zealand, I can assure you. But that is according to a new survey by the recruitment firm Hayes. But a local human resource professor says the issue lies with a lack of support and empathy from the top. Here's Emile Donovan.
If you've ever watched the British TV series The Office, you'll know what bad management sounds like.
He fears my methods because he doesn't understand my methods, you know. Human nature, the unknown, sure, but relax, you know. I don't want all this, oh, what are you doing, what are you doing, how are you doing it? No. Judge me by my results.
But a new survey by a recruitment firm, Hayes, suggests poor managers could be driving Kiwis into alternative employment. The online poll of more than 850 skilled professional workers shows just over half have left a job specifically to get away from a manager. And a trip to Wellington's Midland Park, a popular lunchtime spot for such workers, reveals some who've shared that experience.
I can't tell you what happened, but I can speak to the bullying and unethical practices that didn't align with my own values. And the apathy, I think, around that.
But fortunately, some were at the opposite end of the spectrum.
He's awesome, amazing, listens to you. Yeah, my bosses, one of my good friends, pretty understanding.
Hayes Managing Director Jason Walker says there are a lot of factors at play here, chief among them the assumption that a new manager will be able to slip into the role seamlessly.
Once someone's appointed as a manager, there's a natural assumption that they'll be able to manage people when, you know, you do still need to invest and develop and train managers to, you know, engage, attract, inspire and motivate their staff.
Mr Walker identifies several types of manager who rub their workers up the wrong way. They include the micromanagers, glory hunters, nitpickers and bosses who let poor performers get away with it. But Peter Boxall, a human resources professor at Auckland University, says it's not always the manager's fault. He says many roles, particularly in middle management, can be isolating, and senior figures need to help their staff link the coalface with the upper echelons.
The organisation in which they're now managing needs to help them develop into that role, and it needs to offer them sufficient support when they're in that role to cope with the pressures and the stresses and the strains.
But Jason Walker says workplaces also need to think about which staff suit management roles, rather than viewing these positions as bog-standard promotions for frontline workers.
Do your best performers make your best managers? And more often than not, they don't, because top performers tend to be fairly selfish with their time and very competitive individually in terms of their own productivity and output. And more often than not, that doesn't translate to having the skills required to manage a team.
Mr Walker says the best managers are chameleons who can adapt to suit the situation, and hirers and firers would do well to keep that in mind. For Checkpoint, Emile Donovan.
Just before we leave you tonight, an update on the 3 family members in Waikato Hospital who are being treated for botulism. Now, 2 members of the family are in a stable condition, we're told, but one has been in intensive care since the family was admitted to hospital last Friday. This, of course, after eating a meal of wild boar. We've just heard from Waikato Hospital now that all 3 are now in a stable condition. All 3 now are in a stable condition. So that does sound like a gradual improvement and a slight improvement on the situation we've heard. Thank you to Waikato Hospital for that statement updating us on their situation. Let's go to some feedback before we do leave you tonight, because there's been coming in all evening on Manus Island. This regarding the 2 guards that we've spoken to this week on this issue and their concerns about the people they dealt with there. This listener says regarding the Manus Island detainees, sex abuse, drug abuse and criminal action is most concerning, this listener says. How can these men be labelled refugees when their parents are sending them substantial amounts of money to gamble with, which was one of the claims made by one of the guards this evening. The gentleman just interviewed talked of Australian propaganda. This is Amnesty International's Grant Belden is referring to there. But this listener says, how can these reports of violence and sex crimes be propaganda when they're coming out of the mouths of guards who have actually worked there and seen it with their own eyes? This needs to be taken seriously. Who is trying to pull the wool over our eyes? Thanks for all your feedback from all sides of the divide on this issue, both tonight and over the week. And that's Checkpoint for this evening, and that's me for the week, filling in for John Campbell. It's interesting to see how those on the other half of the day live. John will be back with you on Monday evening, and I'll be back on Morning Report, so normal transition resumes. Thanks so much for listening throughout the week. Highlights can be heard on Late Edition at 10:15 this evening. All of our stories, of course, on the website. Thank you to all the Checkpoint team for their support during the week, and thanks all of you for listening.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Immigration New Zealand is confident its systems for vetting refugees are robust enough to keep out criminals as debate continues over Manus Island refugees. 3 members of a family hospitalised after eating wild boar are being treated for botulism. The Ministry of Health is considering whether to tighten the regulation of sunscreens. And Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe has been holding direct talks with the army over his future. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Country Life is leaving the Earth behind this week.
This is the sound of a spacecraft that actually travelled through the tail of a comet. And what you're hearing there are the sounds of the particles from that comet hitting the spacecraft.
Come and visit the Space Museum in a small Waikato town.
This one is the sound of solar flares.
Hear this and other rural stories on Country Life, Friday night at 9 and Saturday.